Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing great today. This is Juan Castillo, and welcome to DNAVerse podcast. Being in the decentralized science area, it is not always easy because it requires certain educational effort to gain adoption and penetrate the market with new services and products. And that is the reason why the goal of this podcast is to promote conversations about the space and certainly add as much value as we can to the audience. So in this regard, our guest today couldn't be a better fit for this. He's a doctor of law at the University of Buffalo and PhD in philosophy with a postdoctorate in bioethics and medical ethics at Yale University, as well as Harvard Business School alumni. He's teaching and writing about ethics in technology for 25 years. He's currently lecturing in philosophy at the Texas A&M University and the fourth feature author of Who Owns You? The Corporate Gold Rush to Patent Your Genes. He's the CEO and co-founder of Encryptgen, Dr. David Koepsell. David, thanks for being with us. I think it's an honor that you use the time to be today with us. We have some sort of similarities in projects, and I would like to know more about your journey in the space. But first of all, about your background, how you went from law and philosophy to become an entrepreneur with genomics on the blockchain. Tell us a bit more about your background. How do you combine both what I believe is your passion about philosophy, ethics, and Web3 and science?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I've been writing and teaching in philosophy of science and ethics and research integrity now for about 2 decades. And I started by lecturing at the University of Buffalo, a research integrity course for graduate students. And that course focused a lot on Robert Merton's, what he calls the ethos of science. And there are values that Merton identifies as necessary for science to proceed in a normal way, for it to not be pathological, and for it to be able to be properly called science. And among those principles are universalism, communalism, organized skepticism. And those principles are really, essential to this new movement, which we actually coined the term of for DeSci. And back in 2017, I'd moved to Mexico, and my wife is a pharmacogenomic scientist. And we had been collaborating on issues surrounding ethics in the use of genomic data. Her interests, of course, are to have more access to data, and my interests were to make sure that access was equitable and just and ethical. So while we're used to writing papers, we thought maybe this time we could actually build something. So that's how we founded Encryptgen, in order to make the access to genomic data more democratic, to make sure it was decentralized, to be able to allow people to have some say in how their data is transferred and for what purposes, and also to get paid for it, which is essentially what Encryptgen does, and when we launched in 2018 in order to assure that.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think it's an interesting topic. What was the first drive? Was more that the genomic side, or maybe the motivation of giving people the control of their data, being in ethical data and information? Maybe it was a combination of having your wife in this area, and then you just put one on one, right, two together, and say, okay, maybe we can just combine and secure this information for people, give a utility behind it.
Yeah, so we learned a lot along the way. So we learned that there's actually a great deal of people out there who've done genetic testing. The direct-to-consumer testing market is about 50 million people right now around the world. And that's a lot of data that's currently being monopolized by the testing companies. So those testing companies don't make their money by selling those tests. They make their money by remarketing the data. And we realized that is an opportunity, and that's also a source of injustice that we could correct. So we thought if we built a marketplace where people can directly market and profit from the sale of their own genomic data, in science, we could solve two things at once. One is making sure people are compensated for the value of their data, and the other is making sure there's a lot more data out there available for researchers to do studies with. And genomic data, de-identified genomic data, is perfect for that because it can be used along with some self-reported metadata to do some important studies. So if we could get those 50 million users of direct-to-consumer testing to start to put their data on our gene chain, which we started to do, then we would have more democratized access to the data for science, and we would be able to make sure people get paid. So both of those are the tie for exactly what we did.
Yeah, having the genetic data available for the community, for the scientific community, it's key to keep researching and finding more ways to break down the code and keep researching and so on. But there is still this sort of this centralization, right? Because you still need to get to any laboratory or any company to do these DNA sample kits, and somehow they will have the data behind maybe, and then bring
Well,
in integrate to your platform afterwards, right? What's
yeah,
the point there?
all those testing companies have opt-ins. While they have the sample, they don't have the right to use that data unless you opt in. A lot of people do. So about 80% of the users of those testing companies agree to let their data be used for science because that's how they're told it's being used. But what it is being used in commerce first to profit those companies, and it is being used in science. But that's not democratic. It is centralized. It's monopolistic. And we can solve that easily by building more of these sort of DeSci platforms where we allow the data to flow freely and to benefit the people whose data is being uploaded.
Yeah. So do you think the blockchain is a solution for this case, or it's more about how privacy is managed? Because as you say, people opt in. We always opt in and say yes, agree with every policy we see around because we don't really have time to do it. And maybe there's also one of the reasons why everybody's just pushing things. Yeah, I want my test done and that's it. Right? And why not? It's a good thing. So what do you think could be a solution here? Maybe even if it's decentralized and public chain and permissionless, you think blockchain could solve this situation to see exactly in which stage your data is or who is managing what?
It can help, of course. Blockchains provide us with immutable audit trails that allow us to see where the data is going, who's buying it, and for how much. It's certainly part of the solution. A huge part of the solution that hasn't been addressed by anyone really yet is the legal status of genomic data, because nobody owns it. Even you don't own it. There's no technology can give you ownership of that data because ownership is a legal condition and it's created by policy, by laws and public policy. And nobody's done that yet. We think that blockchain is part of the solution, but we think ultimately there needs to be a couple of other things happening socially. One is that people understand what's happening with their data, understand how these companies monopolize and profit from data, but also that we need to get our policymakers to address the big
Ownership
in the law that allows your data not to be owned by anyone, even by you. Because without that, you're not going to have any rights over that data to begin with.
Absolutely, and maybe that's the way initially. That could be a way where the user, the individual, could safely profit from it, knowing who actually owns what, or maybe what stage of the genomic data that is. Even if it's yourself, you legally are part of the process or not. Maybe this company that you actually giving away your consent, you opt in to do it. Maybe they are now becoming legal guardians of your data. So the genomic market is quite large, and I think basically covers worldwide everybody, because everybody will have access to this. The tests have been getting democratized. The cost level of these sample kits are actually going lower, economies of scale are making this possible. So what do you foresee as a market opportunity here? What do you think the actual size of a realistic percentage of population could access safely to this service?
Yeah, it's obviously a huge market opportunity. That 50 million people are low-hanging fruit in that market. But we are being acquired right now by a company called Indigenous AI, which is an African-American veteran-owned company that is seeking to address one of the big issues in genomic data right now, and that is the lack of representation of African-Americans in data sets. And this is a huge problem for the science. It's a huge problem for the medicine. The genomic data market right now is hugely overrepresented by white European populations. And Indigenous acquired us to help to provide the ability to compensate members of African communities and African American communities who they are in the process of getting data sets from for the use of their data. One of the things I used to teach about when I still teach about when I'm teaching bioethics is the Henrietta Lacks case. If you're not familiar with it, it's a sort of textbook case. The lack of equity in the use of minority data and samples in science. Henrietta Lacks, of course, is responsible for the HeLa cells, which are all over the world now and part of scientific studies everywhere. They're these immortal cancer cells that have been used in research for 50 years now, more than 50 years. She was never compensated for her contributions to science. She was hardly ever recognized for that until recently when in the US, the NIH settled with her family to help bring some justice to that case. And we founded Encryptgen really as part of our impetus was to prevent that sort of thing in the future. Indigenous recognized that and realized that the power of our platform to be able to bring that sort of equity to future studies and is using it for their work in Africa and among African American communities.
Yeah, before our conversation, actually, I came across a project for the Latino community. There was a bit breaking down a bit, as you say, with the African American. Now they're going to be addressing the Latino minority in a way of, okay, let's also pay attention to this segment of the population which has been overlooked, I believe, as well. Do you think this is the future of genetic sequencing, like to address every sector of the population? I would say not even country, I would say just ethnicities, and maybe just gather all together under the same umbrella. So, okay, let's now share data and let's put everything together to see what's the outcome, right?
Yeah, it's absolutely vital. There's huge mysteries right now about the genetic component of vulnerability to COVID-19, for instance. And we need huge GWAS studies to be able to solve this. My wife is involved in some here in Mexico, and this has to be done all over the world to find out why some populations, some people are more vulnerable than others. So it's absolutely the future of genomic science, and medicine and precision medicine, for instance, is a huge opportunity for genomics, but only if we are equitable in the use of data, only if we are representative in the collection of data, and only if populations trust science to use that data in ways that they can trust.
We have been talking about ownership of the data. That is a legal issue right now. We should address more legislation about it. And do you think that the genes should be patentable? There is an ethical dilemma behind. What do you think could be the outcome behind patenting our genes?
So I wrote a book about why we shouldn't patent genes, and I stand by that. So before the Myriad case in which gene patents were overturned, I argued essentially the same that the Supreme Courts in the US and Australia agreed with, that naturally occurring genes are products of nature and shouldn't be patented. So I don't think naturally occurring anything should be patentable. That's not what patents are for. I think that if we're going to have claims to privacy or claims to ownership for genes, it's going to have to be an entirely different sort of claim than a property claim. Property is based upon the notion of exclusive control on the sort of naturally occurring phenomena behind possession, and data isn't like that. So you're going to have some other sort of regime in which people would have some sort of rights to the data. Tissues are another thing entirely. Certainly in vivo, the tissues are yours until they're no longer part of your body. But that presents a real problem and that's the whole Moore case out of California. And the problem was with the HeLa cells is that once they're no longer part of your body, you don't have a property claim. So we need to think, legal scholars need to address this, and they need to do so working with scientists, because there's also a big danger that in being overly protective or extending property notions to this sort of thing, you could really hinder the science. And that's exactly why we created what we did, in order to help propel the science and prevent people from being used without compensation or without their knowledge.
Do you think that platform like yours could solve this problem? Because in your opinion, we're discussing ethical dilemmas about patenting or ownership, and it's maybe, as you said, the scholars should decide how ways forward for this. Do you think that one of your solution or our solution, it could be one more out there to give this tool to everybody to say, okay, maybe you can own it legally, but you could use it legally within A, B, C platform? Do you think this is how the private initiative could solve or help in this direction?
So I think they can help, absolutely. We wouldn't have done this if we didn't think it would help. And we encourage your projects too, for the same reason. All of these are helpful. None of them are going to solve any of these problems, again, without the public policy and legal changes necessary that I've discussed about before. Yeah, it's a part of the puzzle, but it's not the full puzzle. There's a huge, also, as an educator, I have to say there's a huge demand for public education about the science and about the legalities involved. So that's something that we must also do in the process.
Yeah. When we were discussing about our project DNAVerse, by the way, I don't know if you have checked what we do and what's your impression. I would love to hear that. We were discussing obviously on the legal requirement, the data management, how to store it, who actually owns it, and we came to the conclusion that there are many solutions out there that are doing an amazing job, like yours, for example, that they could provide value in that direction. So what we're doing is to give it a twist, right? We just translate essential markers into a visualization of your DNA so you can actually stake it as an NFT and generate more value beyond the data or the metadata behind the smart contract. What do you think about what we're doing? How do you see this market getting more into the visualization than data usage?
So I think there's value to what you're doing. One is that you're giving people another approach to their data. I particularly like the artistic element. We had back in April of 2018 worked with an artist to develop a unique piece of art based on my genome, and we auctioned that off as an NFT. So we're in favor of that because it brings attention and it brings interest of the public to the data in a whole new way. I do think that there are obvious limitations to all of these technologies that, as I've said many times, the law and policy will have to address. But all of these are great in the sense that they bring attention to and make interesting the field of genomics, educate people a little bit about it, and hopefully encourage scientists to start to work with the public in a new way, which is, I think, also one of the innovations that we thought our product was going to do that will democratize the science, and that's really essential.
Fantastic. Yeah, absolutely. And what about the metaverse? We are going into this direction of technology, AI, in a light speed. That one of our motivation was to humanize this and to bring genomics and to bring data and to bring DNA, because we believe that the humankind is going to this realm of the blur lines of what is AI, what is a bot, what is a human, how do we want to interact with all the social and enhancement of our relationship. How do you foresee in the metaverse and this relationship between humans and artificial intelligence?
So I'm actually a big skeptic of AI. So I don't think we're going to see real general AI perhaps ever. But I do think that the metaverse is an important new social reality that we're building, partly underlined by the current pandemic, but also by the climate crisis. Because unless we start to move a lot of our social interactions online, instead of burning all these fossil fuels to travel all over the world, we're not going to make it. So I think we need to focus on making sure that the metaverse is built with ethical and equitable considerations in mind. One of the things I know for certain is that a lot of the AI tools used for interacting with the metaverse are racially biased. For instance, in teaching, there's proctoring software for exams that I won't use because I know it's racially biased. And so we need to focus on making sure that as we build this metaverse, we don't recapitulate the equitable failures we've grown used to in the real world and build a truly groundbreaking social medium where we can interact more progressively.
Yeah, if we go in this direction, it's a fantastic answer, because we try to address the problem with the human verification to give as much as we can to identify a real person behind and not a bot, or that this person is actually that person of this problem that we see nowadays in Web2 and in real life, that we don't migrate those to the metaverse. I think this is an important point that should be addressed before we get deeply into this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think I'm not as worried about human AI as I am with the overuse of machine language algorithms to do harm, which we are already seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. David, it has been a pleasure. We don't want to really extend it. It could be hours of discussion of your expertise and background. I think it's fantastic. It's fascinating what you're doing. And we would love to have you around in the space for a long time and ask to be together as well and sharing.
Well, we'll remain in touch. I know that. And I'm happy to come back anytime.
Absolutely. So please, everybody, give David a follow. He's doing an amazing job with Encryptgen, which also you will find on LinkedIn. And just visit the website because it's fantastic, which you will have around here. And for us, as always, thanks for being with us. You will have our social media handle. Please give us a follow, and we continue building the space slowly but surely. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.